sports scores, but there are none of those.
All right, everybody. I'm Suzette Martinez Standring with Professor Stephen Tumolo, and on behalf of Eastern Nazarene College, we welcome Linda Varrell, who will be speaking to us today on the subject of public relations and persuasive writing. Be aware, students, that this will be recorded and will be used for educational purposes. Yesterday, Linda was very gracious to confirm that she was okay with the tape recording. And before we start, I know that Professor Tumolo has a few remarks.
Well, I was just looking at some of the student assignments, and I just thought several of them really spoke to what we're doing here today, and our guest speaker, Linda Varrell, talking about public relations. So one of the assignments, Justin Valadez, in the What's News assignment, you picked up an article from Vice News that dealt with the China government's publications and messaging to its people about the, what's his name? It's the Dr. Li Wenliang, I believe, from Wuhan. And correct. So, excuse me, I had to jump up there, quiet my phone. One thing that we've emphasized, and I just want to underline again, is this enterprise of meaning making. We live in a world that's filled with mediated messages. So much of what we know or come to believe we know comes not through our own experience, but through others' experience as they are mediating it or bringing it to us through a middle person, through a middle entity or a medium. So much of what we know as 21st century humans comes to us pre-packed. And there are many sources trying to influence our thinking, to influence our understanding, to influence our perception of reality. And the article you picked, Justin, I think was one of them, how the Chinese government, through its media, was at first telling one story of Dr. Li Wenliang, saying he is a traitor, and then changing the story very completely. He's a loyal communist brother. And I think you picked up on that. And I think it's just a great lead into you, Linda Varrell, and to public relations, is that you're engaged in public relations and contributing to meaning making in the sense that we're making of what's going on and shaping people's perceptions of what's really happening. So I just wanted to affirm the work of doing students and to say thank you, Linda, for addressing this topic, which gets at a key issue of how we make sense of our world.
Okay. Well, thank you, Stephen and Suzette. I appreciate being here today, and it's wonderful to see all of you. I know everyone must be at home quarantined and not really going out, so this must be a nice break for everyone.
I would like to introduce Linda because she just has an extraordinary background. We are so privileged to have her with us today. Linda Varrell lives and works in Maine. She is the founder of Broadreach Public Relations, which delivers strategic intelligence and communication services. She is a nationally accredited public relations expert and project manager with leadership in strategic communications, crisis management, marketing and forecasting, and so much more across many major industries. I met Linda Varrell in 2017 when she was president of the Maine Public Relations Council. Today, she is a board member of the Maine Press Association as a public relations professional. And welcome, Linda. We are so looking forward to what you are going to tell us today. So please, please start, and we're looking forward to this.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, I want to circle back first to something that, do you want me to call you Professor Tumolo or Stephen and Suzette? Do you have a preference?
Oh,
it's fine.
Either's fine.
I want to circle back to something you said early on, and that we're in the business of meaning making. One of the things that I stress with young people is that nothing has meaning until we give it meaning. And, our industry on both sides are really in that business of giving things meaning. And in times of intense crises like right now, it's so easy to make connections between things that are unrelated. It's so easy to make assumptions, to take what you see as fact. And the problem with that, to your point, I think in the article that you found, is you're finding contradicting stories. You're finding, unfortunately, you are finding fake news, fraud, different things like that. So I always like to work with young people and share that insight as far as, nothing really has meaning until we give it meaning. So thank you, Suzette and Stephen, again for having me. I have spent over 25 years in, not only communications, but in public relations, crisis, project management, and sales. Prior to starting Broadreach, which is now 13 years old, I was in banking. And a lot of people say, well, oh, were you doing marketing in banking? And no, I was actually a banker. I could do a loan for you right now if you wanted me to. But I worked with branch managers, doing lending, opening accounts, took over as vice president of operations, handling deposit and loan servicing, and then doing a lot of the major projects similar to product rollouts, mergers, acquisitions, buildings, opening and closing branches, different things along those lines. And so I'm frequently asked, well, how in the world did you get into communications? Well, the common denominator with communication, with all of these projects, is effective communications. You cannot get anything done through people if you cannot communicate effectively. And so that was the piece that I really enjoyed, was ensuring that I was able to communicate and translate what the IT people were saying to the tellers, what senior management was saying to the middle managers. I was kind of that person in the middle that really made sure folks knew what was happening, what their role in it was, how they could get more information, and just really be informed. Because in business today, that's one of the number one needs that employees have, is they want to feel in on things. They want to feel like they know what's going on in the organization. And you keep hearing that word transparency. So as I indicated, Broadreach is 13 years old. My first partner, interestingly enough, I shared a little bit of this with Suzette. My first partner was the editor of the Portland Press Herald, Eric Bloom. He was a business editor, and he was also an award-winning journalist. He had uncovered some major flaws in the workers' comp system here in Maine back in the day. God, it was probably 20 plus years ago. And Maine was one of the unsafest states in the country when it came to OSHA violations and just corporate, mishandling of employees, and employees here just simply were not safe. And he uncovered that there were major flaws in the entire, workers' comp world. There was abuse. There were just a lot of things that were going on, and he had series after series. And through his work specifically, he was able to affect change here in Maine to the point where it resulted in a new industry being created. We now have a company called MEMIC, M-E-I-C, Maine Mutuals Insurance Company, which operates up and down the Eastern Seaboard. And it's all about ensuring that employees are safe. And it's totally changed the workers' comp system. And Maine is now one of the safest states in the country as far as workplace injuries. So, having Eric on board was kind of an interesting dynamic, because he was the journalist, and when I was in banking, I was a bank security officer, I was a project manager, and so I was in the trenches and he was reporting from the trenches. So the two of us together made a really good pair. He stayed with me for about 5 years, and then he went on to become, and you may have seen his name, he's now external communications for Hannaford Del Hayes. So I don't know if you've heard of the Hannaford supermarkets, if you have them in Massachusetts, New York, etc. Food Lion, all of that. So that's Eric's job now. So he went from journalism into a PR agency, and now he's corporate spokesperson for a large global company. So it gives you a little bit of insight into how your work in journalism can transcend into other types of organizations, because at the core of all of this is truly communications. So with that, I'm going to stop for a second. I've given you enough of my background, so I want to see if there's any initial questions before we shift gears here onto a different topic.
I have a question. What was like your biggest struggles like transitioning into public relations or communications?
Yeah, that's a great question. So my biggest struggle initially was having the self-confidence that my skill set actually transferred into my new role. So if you think about it, December 31st, 2006 was my last day at the bank. January 1, I started in public relations, and I was no longer in corporate America, and I was no longer in a safe career. So I was doing what I had already been doing at the bank, doing press releases and attending events and, you know, introducing experts to reporters about what was happening with the mortgage crisis, or what was happening, you know, in financial services, you know, in the Northeast. But I think for me, it was almost like that imposter syndrome. Do I actually belong here? Do I actually have the skills to do this? So that's what motivated me to pursue my accreditation in public relations, because I needed to know what I didn't know. And what I didn't know, interestingly enough, was the journalism side. The law around writing, copyright, libel, slander, you know, all of that. I didn't really have a good handle on research, primary research and secondary research, and scientific research, and how that all plays into our work. So those for me were kind of the three areas. I didn't know it at the time, but I understood strategy, because you can't build a building and manage a project without having a communication strategy. And what are we doing? Who needs to be involved? What's their part? How often do they need to be communicated? How are we going to communicate with them? How are we going to know that they understand? And so when you think through all of that, so it was really that transference of skills, and was I going to be successful on my own in my own business? And then the second piece that was scary was, you know, wait a minute, if I'm having to do the work, how am I going to go out and get new business? So, you know, that's always a challenge as well when you're starting a company. Is you need to have a marketing plan. You know, you need to figure out how to get your name out there. So great question. Thank you.
Linda, I don't know if you had a specific topic that you would like to cover next, or if you wanted questions to be fielded to you.
Yeah, why don't I cover a couple of things?
Great.
I really want to talk about, Suzette had asked me the question as to why message, audience, and media, including social media, are important in PR writing. And so, you know, in public relations, we represent entities. So we might represent a nonprofit, a corporation, an individual, a community, a developer, you know, different things along those lines. We represent entities. In journalism, you represent the general public, you know, and I'm sure you're talking about, you know, the constitutional aspects of journalism, the rights of a free press, and all of those things. So, you know, your purpose may appear a lot loftier We're representing more entities and brands. So there is a difference in terms of the responsibility. You have a responsibility to the greater citizenry. We have a responsibility to our companies and to our leadership in that vein. But when it comes to message, I want to share with you, since this crisis started, and we've been monitoring and working it probably since that last week in February, when one of our clients was really nervous about an event and actually asked us, should we cancel the event? And it was in February. The event was in February. Should we cancel the event? And, we were really nervous about that, but we went forward with the event. We had a no contact policy. They put out more hand sanitizer when you could still get it. But once all this started, I really started paying attention to messaging, to what companies and brands and how they were positioning themselves, what people were saying. And I found myself repeatedly just looking at my computer or watching TV and just saying, will you just go sit down? Like, just go sit down. Meaning, what you're saying is so irrelevant right now that it's not getting through to anybody. So if you think about what messaging you want to hear, it needs to be congruent with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What's the most important thing you're seeing in the news right now? People are out of toilet paper, right? People are out of work. People are going to the grocery store and they're just worried for their safety. Everyone's having to wear a mask now when you go out. So the companies that are trying to speak too lofty, that are getting ahead of themselves, and they're not talking about how we're in this together or our job is to keep you safe, their messages aren't getting through to anybody. I mean, you're not thinking about buying a car right now, right? I mean, most people probably aren't. You're not thinking about buying a car. You're not thinking about going to Disney, though. You might be thinking about going to Disney when this is all over. But to put messages out there like that right now would be what we call tone deaf. I don't know if you've heard that phrase, but that brands are being accused of being tone deaf. Also, you want to be thinking about frequency. So if my audience are people who want to buy cars, right now, what can I be saying about them other than we're taking care of our employees, we're in this together, and that's about it. If we talk about anything more than that, the watchers, meaning all of you who aren't interested in buying cars, are going to be sitting there in social media going, what's this brand doing? Why are they talking about things that are irrelevant right now that no one can even think about doing? So message, audience, and media are really important in times of crises, because the crises is driving the messaging rather than the organization. So it's a reverse of what would normally be taking place, because if you're not in tune with what's happening externally, internally, everything you say is going to be incongruent with what's reality for most people. So in a normal environment, you would identify all your audiences, you would figure out what matters to them, how to connect them externally, and then deliver those messages through a myriad of channels. So channels might be email, social media, the media, might be newsletters, might be affinity groups, different things along those lines. So for us in PR, while we work with the media, we work with the journalists, we're also responsible for a multitude of other channels and areas to get our clients' information and our company's information out there. I don't know if anyone has any questions on that or why they're important in PR writing.
Well, I'm glad you addressed that, because I was telling you earlier that I almost find more comfort from some of the commercials than I do from national leadership.
Right. Right.
And I also want to know, and I think this is something that a lot of us don't really understand the inner workings of PR. Does your company get involved with commercial making and things like that? I mean, is that a specific type of job or field that you enter, or is it all part of the public relations firm?
Yeah, Suzette, that's a great question. So Broadreach is a pure public relations firm. So we work with clients on high-level strategy, audience identification, messaging, communication strategy across their organization. So that could be internal communication with their employees. It could be external communication with their stakeholders and with the media. It could also be, if it were a publicly traded company, we could be talking to analysts, different things along those lines. So when we have a message we need to get out there, we have to decide what channel it needs to go. And if the channel is broadcast, we have two different options. Well, we actually have three different options depending on the type of the organization. So the first option is we pitch a story to broadcast media, which we can't always control. That's a different part of the conversation, and I'll talk about that in a minute in terms of controlling the message. But we can pitch it to the media. We can create an ad that we control 100% and buy that space. So that's called paid media versus getting a story, which we call earned media. We can also work to get what's called a public service announcement if it involves an organization, because most broadcasts as well as newspapers have a responsibility, and as part of their government tariffs and pricing, they have to give back a portion of their time and a portion of their space for the public good. So when you see public service announcements, those are the media outlets fulfilling their obligation to serve the greater good as well. So for us, advertising might be something that we would hire an ad agency to help us with the actual messaging, the production, figuring out what we want for talent, figuring out what that media buy is going to look like. But it's a very different type of work, because you're working with creatives, you're working with media that could be across the country and across multiple channels. And so a lot of times we have partners who will reach out to and will say, okay, we want to do a digital media campaign, and we'll hire a digital agency that's what they do for a living. And so we'll partner with them. We'll be more of the project manager. So you heard me talk about that about my prior career. We'll be the project manager, and they'll do actually the execution. So in our world, we'll hire videographers, we'll hire photographers, we'll hire ad agencies, we'll hire digital agencies, we'll hire printers or graphic designers, but we try to keep the control of the client with us. So we're more like a marketing director or communications director, where we're figuring out what we want to do and how we're going to get there, and then we bring the various talent to the table to make that happen. And we've found that this model works better, and it's more efficient as well as more financially sustainable, because you're not trying to keep work for everyone. You're not trying to keep your graphic designer busy. You're not trying to keep, everybody busy. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. Does anybody else have any questions for Linda on this subject?
I do. Do you find that the paid versus earned, does one of them work better than the other usually as far as reach?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And One of the theories that we've embraced in the public relations world is called the PESO model. I don't know if you've heard that. It's PESO. And it's the PESO model of public relations and content development. And the theory is that, you know, you need to have a balance across all of those areas. So we might have a great story. So let's talk about, let's actually talk about one of our clients. So one of our clients, actually it's one of Josiah's clients, is a large credit union here in Maine. And they launched a program a couple of years ago called Ending Hunger on Campus. And so with Ending Hunger on Campus, we can, all right, how do we want to get that story out there? So if you apply the PESO model to that, if we say, okay, we want to drive donations from the campuses, plus we want to get some earned media, plus we want it in our social media channels. So we would put together a paid, earned, and owned campaign. So we might, in the paid space, put ads together for Facebook and LinkedIn and even, you know, in Google search for the actual campaign and how to donate. Earned media, we would certainly pitch the story to campus publications, to area publications. If we were to do shared, obviously we'd be sharing that story across all the social media channels, and then owned might be some blog posts or different things along those lines. So you really need the balance of those four things working well together, because what they're finding is if you just do paid, and you don't have that third party validation, which is what you folks are going to be doing, because the third party validation is the earned media. If you don't have that, then all you're doing is just spewing content. And you're not really getting that credibility piece. You're raising awareness, great, but when someone searches for you, they don't find anything. They don't find anything substantive, you know, in terms of that validation or that third, you know, that third party testimony. Does that make sense?
It does. Thank you.
Linda, I can add one thing to that if you don't mind.
No, I don't mind at all.
Sure. So one of the other advantages of earned media is that it typically has a longer shelf life than paid media. Perfect example is another one of our clients. They had a proprietary product that they launched 5 years ago that got a nationally syndicated coverage from AP. It got picked up all over the country. They saw a surge in sales right at the beginning, but they didn't sustain that over the following years. And so, saw 5 years later is that they're continuing to get traffic to their website and sales from the earned media that they generated 4 or 5 years ago. And then, you know, they brought us on to start to continue to pick that back up and generate more of it because they recognized the value that it had when their story was new. And so our role was really helping them figure out what new storylines do you have and how can we generate that kind of buzz again. But I think the point about shelf life is a really important one when you think about return on investment.
That's a great point. Thank you, Josiah.
Linda, I know that you're going to be touching on the subjects of persuasive writing. And, you know, one of my observations is that in journalism, you have so many words, right? And you're doing a news story and you have a beginning, a middle, and an end, you know, elements of new journalism. But in public relations writing, I'm kind of wondering, what is the format for that? It must be a lot shorter, a lot more abbreviated than a news story. So what's the format and how do you punch so much persuasion into an even shorter form than a 500-word column?
Right. So if you think about it, the reverse is true for public relations professionals, is that we have to convince you that we have a great story and that you should interview our client and write a story about them. So how do you do that? Well, we've learned over time that simply calling up the reporter and saying, hey, I've got this great company, I think you should talk to them. It has to be timely and it has to be relevant. And so first and foremost, so I'll give you an example. I'll give you a couple of examples in public relations communication space, because we have our communication channel with the media, but then we also have our communication channels with other stakeholders. So always remember, in public relations, the media is one of our audiences, but it isn't all of our audiences. And we actually have to think of them differently. So let's use the case, I can back up. Let's use the case of an acquisition, mergers and acquisitions. And so if you're in corporate communication, you're doing all of the writing, all of the strategy and all of the writing around a merger. You have to be thinking about it from two different perspectives. You have to think about it from an internal perspective and like, what do all of my stakeholders need to know? Like, is the name going to change? Is the leadership going to change? Are you still going to be involved in the community? Like, having all of those questions thought through and ready to go. Then you have to really look at that deal with a critical eye, as someone from the media would. Well, why are they selling? Were they in financial trouble? Are they going to be laying everybody off? You know, where's the hero, the villain, where's the meat that, someone in journalism might latch onto, is because whenever there's a merger or an acquisition, there's always skeletons that come out of the closet. And so we as PR professionals have to anticipate all of that. So we'll actually create two documents. We'll create an FAQ, which is for stakeholders like employees and families and customers and community and different things like that. And then we'll create another document that says, what are the hard media questions that could come out of the woodwork, that our CEO, now we might not prep him for those questions, but we will at least put them in front of him. Sorry, those are my dogs. We'll put those questions in front of them so that they're exposed to the possibility that, hey, this might come up. Do you think it's something we need to talk about? Because our job is not just about communicating, it's about mitigating risk and managing reputation. Because really in the end, that's what our work is. And you asked me about marketing. Marketing projects an image out there, the brand, the logo, the colors, the taglines, the ads. Public relations reflects that image back in terms of reputation. And that's when you have issues, is when the two aren't congruent. When a company says we're awesome and we give great service, but then in social media, it's like they've got ones in all of their reviews and all of these, bad social media ratings. Wait a minute, there's a disconnect here, and that's trouble. So our communication model, when we're talking with the media, is all based on the same model that you have. So we have to have a lead. We have to have a buttoned up, what is it? The nut graph. I don't know if you've talked about that, but we have to have a buttoned up first paragraph, like how this relates to greater context. And we also have to have like why it's important and why this client should be talking about it at this point. So our communication model is exactly the same as it relates to talking to the media. When we're talking to our other audiences, when you think about it, we usually have something we want them to do. Like right now, if you're a bank, if you need information on the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Loan, you need to go here. If you have questions about whether our branches are open, you need to go there. So we still have that same, we still have to anticipate, but the questions are going to be different because they're meeting the needs of how that stakeholder is going to actually engage with that brand. And so we're more about, what do we need from that audience, or what does that audience need from us? What's the call to action? And then how do we create that feedback loop to make sure you know, the messages are free flowing back and forth. So we're actually having to do kind of a dual track as it relates to messaging and communication, because we have the stakeholders that engage with us on a daily basis, and then we have the media who we constantly have to be monitoring to make sure that the brand is seen in a positive light. Because right now we have brands that actually don't want to be in the news, and we're working pretty hard to affect that. So it's an interesting balance. So I don't know if that answered your question, Suzette, in terms of what we use for writing model, but I think it's different based on what we're doing.
Yes, it answers a lot of questions. And I don't want to interrupt with any of your prepared thoughts that you want to share with us, but I know that when you use examples, your own personal stories and experiences, it makes it really come alive for us. And, just now you said many clients don't want to be in the news, and it just kind of piqued my interest as to why.
Yeah, they might be having struggles with, like right now, everyone's trying to apply for these loans and these grants and different things like that. So if you had a financial institution that wasn't doing a good job getting that process going, so their customers were unhappy, we would want to kind of keep that client on, on the lowdown versus another client in a different industry that was doing really, really well and pivoting and making things happen. And so a lot of times, those are the things that we're actually monitoring, is what's not going well in an organization and what don't we want to put out there. Because even though it's newsworthy, doesn't mean we want it in the news. So yeah, mitigation, and that's part of the risk. There's a fine line between that privacy and transparency and, the what's newsworthy and what isn't, if that makes sense. So, if being on the inside of organizations, but also sitting on the Maine Press Association board and listening to some of the challenges they have with, Freedom of Information Act requests, and the fact that I have a client that's a municipality. And I've been in meetings with that municipality on things that wouldn't the media love to get their hands on that? But there are certain things that aren't subject to FOIA requests. And that's why a lot of times organizations will hire an outside firm, because, we can work with them at an arm's length on sensitive matters that, need to stay sensitive. Public companies need to keep confidentiality. When the bank that I was at, it was being, we were getting a capital infusion, and it was a major deal, and we were publicly traded. We had to sign non-disclosure agreements, and there were probably a handful of people who knew about that deal, which took us maybe 6 to 8 months to actually message and figure out how we were going to do all of the operational aspects of it and the messaging and who we were going to be talking to before we were able to talk to the media. So at 8:30 in the morning, a phone call went to all of the staff that this was happening at this financial institution. And then at 9 o'clock, the press release went to the market. We had already sent it to the NASDAQ or to the market, because you're required to file because you're publicly traded. So there's all kinds of laws and rules around that and non-disclosure. So it's a fine line between freedom of information and transparency and confidentiality and privacy. So that, and you're in a unique place learning about journalism and finding out what that balance is.
Does anybody else have any questions for Linda before we move on?
I do.
Okay, good.
So I was wondering how how might your communications approach change during a moment of crisis?
That's a great question. So one of the things that we talk about, because it does change and it changes moment by moment, day by day. So the first thing I always ask is what's happening right now? And to do that, we ask two questions. What do we know to be true? And what don't we know? And one of my mantras, and I've had to say this to clients, probably in firmer tones, is there's no such thing as BS in crisis communication. You either know it or you don't know it, and you'll get the information. And so for me, it's a continual conversation with your stakeholders in the media of what you know right now, what you're working on, and when you're going to get back to them. And so to your point, what changes in crisis is all about, I'm going to circle back to this Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Where are we on the hierarchy of needs? Is this truly panic? You know, is it like a Katrina? Is it like a 9/11? Is it, you know, is it a bomb threat? You know, what is it? And are we dealing with a safety issue? You know, so what are we dealing with is really key. The second piece of that is there's no projection, there's no opinion, there's no, again, you either know it or you don't know it. Then you talk about who does know it or how you're going to get that information. The second piece is, am I dealing with authorities? So when I was at the bank and as a bank security officer, you know, when you're dealing with breaches, the Secret Service might be involved. So I couldn't really say much. I might be involved with a fraud situation that involved the FBI, or when one of our branches was robbed, we were dealing with the local authorities. And so you have to take, in crisis communication, you have to take your guidance from, you know, the public authorities who are overseeing and have, quote, jurisdiction over the situation. So right now, what you see in messaging is, our messaging is in concert with, the CDC recommendations, or we're in alignment with what the local authorities are saying, or what first responders or what the healthcare system is saying. And so in a crisis, you're not operating alone. And that's the biggest piece that changes, is who can help and who do I need around this table right now? And that's when companies really stumble, is when they try to do it all themselves. And a crisis, one of the definitions of a crisis is that it exceeds your internal capacity to handle it and to mitigate it. And so if you know that up front, that if we're ever in a crisis, then you know you're going to need additional resources. So a lot of companies that are like federally regulated actually already had plans in place. They have relationships established. So we have companies that actually have us on retainer for just crisis response, so that, we're ready in case something happens for them. But in crisis, it's really about, simple messaging to, a broad base of audiences, and you're in alignment with, whichever authority, has the highest level of authority within that situation, or what we call jurisdiction. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Linda, before you go on, I guess one of the things that I wanted to ask you about, And I'll first start by saying, you know, your reputation and integrity is so great that, you know, you were asked to be a board member on the Maine Press Association. And I know that there was a time when journalists would look at PR people as, you know, the dark side. And now it seems that we're all in the communications business together. And how do we get through it together with integrity and ethics? And so, as you know, the journalism field is under siege, being accused of fake news. And I think that public relations is under siege when they are being labeled as spin doctors. So, you know, what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, so it's interesting. That's a great question, because that is one of the things that when I got into this field, not that I feared it, but recognized that it was a hurdle. And for me, being in communications at a financial institution and having worked within that financial institution, I brought to the table a level of expertise that was different, because I had been in the trenches. I had been in the communities. And so when situations occurred, you bring with it a level of integrity that transcends everything. You know, and I go back to that comment regarding crisis. What do I know? What don't I know? You know, is this the truth? Is it the whole truth? Are we providing context? Because if we can't say what we need to say and it's not the truth, then we shouldn't be saying anything. And it's a fundamental value in corporate America, or, you know, that I feel corporate America is moving toward. You're seeing more transparency. You're seeing, you know, more open communication, more honesty. And the word, it's interesting, the word is spin. And I'm going to use another story. I'll never forget when one of the local reporters here, I had just launched Broadreach. It was 2007, 2008. And we were in the middle of the mortgage crisis. So, you know, basically the mortgage market had fallen out. And this reporter came in and she said, Linda, can you just explain to me what is going on? And she was very honest and very humble, because folks at the time didn't really understand what had happened in the mortgage market. And so she and I sat down and simply had a conversation that wasn't, you know, on record or anything like that. It was educational. It's like, let me help you understand the greater context of how this works. And so within the communication world, there's a piece we didn't talk about. There's a level of business acumen that you really need to have and embrace. You need to understand how different organizations operate within the context of their sector and within the context of the greater community. So when people use the word spin, okay, I always kind of relate that to politics or public affairs or different things along those lines. But spin is about, you know, how do we take the context and shape it to fit the story that we're trying to tell? Again, it's not a word that I like. It's not a word we use. And it's one that I think, you know, public relations in general has gotten a bad rap, because if you think about communications directors across a variety of industry sectors, the communications director for the CDC, the communications director for a major hospital, the communications director for major banks, that isn't their goal to spin. Their goal is to inform. And I think if we can embrace that it's education, it's information, and it's understanding the greater context so that we're working together. Because ultimately, you know, that rising tide lifts all. Now that doesn't mean you're not going to have people out there trying to, you know, what is it, the clickbait, putting out there the headlines with clickbait and stories where the journalists are injecting themselves into the story somehow, and the story became about them versus the company or the person or the organization that they're that they're interviewing. So it's a fine line between, you know, reporting what's happening and, you know, protecting the reputation of the organization that's being interviewed or that's part of the process. And I think if you can come to the table with an assumption that the majority of entities want to do good, then I think that changes your mindset.
That's an excellent response, Linda. Does anybody have any other questions along this line? Okay, then Linda, you know, please feel free to move on to whatever it is that you would like to share with us on these subjects.
No, sure. You know, we talked about what I find interesting about working with the Maine Press Association, and you know, we had been a sponsor, well, we had been a member for a number of years, and felt, you know, the industry is very important to public relations professionals. Because if you didn't exist or it wasn't healthy and sustainable, then, you know, half of our job would probably be gone, in terms of, you know, really working with our clients to get the good news out there or get important news out there. So it was interesting when I joined, and I learned a lot about, you know, how the industry operates as an entity, as a business, and what it needs to sustain it. And to your point, yes, it's getting a bad rap, but if you look at local publications, you look at hyper-local publications, you know, many of them are actually flourishing because people in the communities want that news. They want to, you know, grandmothers want to see their grandkids playing sports, and local people want to see their neighbors in the news. And so the local papers and the local publications are really, you know, doing somewhat well. I don't want to speak for them from a financial perspective, but I know from our perspective that, you know, they're looking for the good news, and they're looking, you know, for ways to stay connected to the community and to be that conduit. Because if you think about it right now, how else are some of these people in rural communities going to be getting the news about their neighbors if they can't go and see each other? They have to read, you know, their hyper-local papers. So it's an industry that is important. It's an industry we need to support. And, you know, like we say, we're all in this together. If I don't provide them factual information, then I'm not doing my job. If I don't provide them access to, you know, the experts, then I'm not doing my job.
Does anybody have questions? Now's your chance. Well, Linda, in the few minutes that we have left for this session, I want you to feel free to share whatever you'd like to, but I'm also very curious, for the sake of the students here today, what kind of traits or skills do you look for in a potential PR person?
Yeah, that's a great question. Because one of the things we didn't talk about was the second company that I own, which is called Word Lab. And it's a Department of Labor apprenticeship program for public relations and communications specialists. And so Brian, who is on as well, Brian went through the program, and we've had conversations like this with the apprentices. What do we look for? What's most important? And I think it's three very important things. The first is curiosity. You really have to have a sense of curiosity of the world around you. And understanding and wanting to learn more about the greater context, and that this is a living, breathing system, and that everything has an impact on everything else. So really understanding and having that curiosity about what's going on around you. I think the second is an understanding or having a sense of business acumen and being knowledgeable So, reading different perspectives. Like I read the daily paper every day. It's just something we've always done. So we read the paper, but then I'll also read, the American Bankers Association daily news bites. I'll read what's happening in, PR Week. I'll read what's happening, I'll look at MSN and all of the news, what's happening in mainstream media. But you need to be informed. You really need to be informed. So it's the curiosity, but then also taking that curiosity to the next level. And then I think the third skill is being able to write. And not everybody can, and that's okay. But being able to put down in your head onto paper, or in video or in audio, but what is that, how are you going to tell that story? And if I could add on to that, it's that level of research. So from a skills perspective, we've got that curiosity, we've got that ability to write, and you've got, knowledgeable and having a level of acumen of understanding how things work. And probably the last one might be empathy. Understanding, you could be talking to people, someone who's starting a new business and they're really, really happy, or like right now in the crisis, you might be talking to a healthcare worker who, was willing to be interviewed and they just saw one of their coworkers die from coronavirus. So there's a level of empathy and humanity that you need to embrace, in that we're dealing with real people and real companies, in times of good and in times of bad.
Linda, this session was absolutely jam-packed with such valuable information. And I really want to thank you for being here today. Does anybody have any questions for Linda before she goes? And if you have any closing remarks, but Linda, thank you so much for being here. And it's such a pleasure to have you.
You're very welcome. No, thank you for having me. And I invite all of you, please feel free to follow me on social media. If you have follow-up questions, I'm out there in LinkedIn and in Facebook. And certainly, touch bases with my team, Josiah and Brian, who kind of come up through the ranks in the PR world. And like I said, Brian has a journalism degree, so but it's been my pleasure, and I look forward to hearing more about all of your careers as they begin to flourish.
Thank you so much, Linda. And a special thanks also to Brian and Josiah for joining us today. It's wonderful. And we wish you continued success. You're certainly a very valuable person in the industry that you cover and that you represent.
Oh, well, thank you, Suzette.
Thank you, Suzette.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And I just want to add my thanks as well. Linda, Eastern Nazarene College is a real social justice mission, and across all the disciplines, we're focused on social justice. And so some of us may have that bias that Suzette talked about, oh, PR, is that promoting social justice, or is that, subverting social justice? But your perspective that we're all in this together, from a public relations perspective, that there's something that we all have in common, and your emphasis on needs, the needs of everyone, and listening well to needs, and your emphasis on empathy really shine a helpful light to me on public relations and your approach. So I just want to thank you for being you and embodying your particular approach, how you're approaching PR.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Stephen. So, and I have a question for all of you. I'd like, and I don't know what you have for time, but I'd be curious kind of what, number one, what your key takeaway was today, and number two, your inspiration for using.
Linda, did you say you'd like to hear from each of the students what their key takeaway was, and what was it? We didn't hear that last thing.
Oh, what was their inspiration for pursuing journalism?
Oh,
For
all
pursuing
right.
journalism, or I would even say more broadly, communication. Some of our students are studying communication arts. So either of those. Question?
All right. You know what? I'm going
Expected.
to call on people. Here we go. Michael, why don't you start?
Okay, so my big takeaway today was definitely just how much communication changes during a crisis situation and how you have to kind of rely on the resources around you. And then I would say the inspiration for getting into communications was I feel like I have a natural talent for that sort of thing, and it's definitely a field where you can help people. So that's a big part for me.
Thank you.
Cooper, how about you?
I thought it was important to see the side of PR from someone who actually does PR, not just, oh, they're gonna skew information to better serve whoever their client is. You're trying to get the truth out there. It just happens to be in a way that is to the company's reputation's interest. It's not hiding facts. It's just trying to actually help, which I think is important. And as far as communication arts, I took a graphic design class, which interested me, which is kind of what brought me here.
Thank you.
Bailey, could you please share your thoughts?
Yeah, so I actually am interested in public relations, and like Cooper said, it is really interesting hearing from somebody who is a professional in that with public relations, because we're used to just like hearing about it. And so yeah, I think that was also interesting hearing how public relations and journalism overlaps. And I guess I didn't really know too much about I guess the correlation between those two career paths. And yeah, I think I picked communication arts just because, just like my goal, I feel like I have, I don't know, I feel like there's a lot of overlapping skills with communication arts, with like marketing and you know, just being able to literally communicate. So I think, I don't know, yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And Brittany, how about you?
Sorry. So I found everything you say to be really interesting. I didn't know much about public relations in a whole, so I think it was cool to learn about your story from transferring to one like job to the other and how they overlapped with each other. I can't talk with each other, which was really interesting because I really didn't know how much like working in a bank versus like being in the public relations side kind of intertwined. So I thought that was really interesting. And I'm a communications major, but I kind of want to focus more on journalism, which I'm going to add as a minor. I've always like had a love of writing and a love of helping people. So I want to find a way to intertwine both of them in my career.
Great.
And how about you, Justin?
I think we touched on it in our last call, but you mentioned something about spinning a story, and I really liked how she touched on the negative context or the negative approach that some reporters take with it, or the stigma that it has. But as reporters, our duty is to kind of fit the context into the story that we're trying to tell with upholding the integrity of what we promised, or not deceiving those that we interview. I don't know if you guys know about the infamous show Joe Exotic, Tiger King, but it was such a hit show, and I watched it. It's a really crazy show that's been all over the news, and almost every single cast member or person that was interviewed is coming out saying that Netflix totally betrayed them and the story that they were promised they were going to tell. And it almost seems like even the enemies of the enemies are agreeing with each other that Netflix totally spin their stories to tell a narrative that did exist but didn't exist to the potential that they put it out to be. So it's interesting to see that, you know, reporting expands over to television, to all sorts of different venues. So it's important to tell the story right, but it's also important to tell the story, period.
Good point.
Kayla?
So I'm actually a psych major. So the one thing that I found really interesting was that you talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs a couple of times. And I never really thought about how that could be viewed from like different lines of work. So I thought that that was interesting. It made me think. And then I'm actually a social relations track. So I think that like, while I don't want to do anything with writing, I do think that taking this class has helped me communicate better. So yeah.
I also forgot to mention that I'm a comms major, so thank you for responding. I don't want to do anything with journalism just yet, but I think it's vital for me to grasp onto the tools for film production because they might come into use later down the road. Sorry.
No, very much so. No, thank you.
Well, thank you all for your comments. And Linda, do you have any closing thoughts?
Oh, well, let me ask all of you, is there something you'd like for me to touch on for just a second?
I can't think of anything at the moment, to be honest. But everything that you did say was really interesting, so.
Thank you, Justin. Thank you.
Yeah, I do agree with Justin. I feel that your presentation was so information-packed, really a lot of insight. And I loved how you so clearly defined the intersection between journalism and public relations, and that it intersects with ethical and effective communication, Linda.
If I could leave you with one thought, in the business and in the greater community, whether it's at a nonprofit, you hear a phrase called having a seat at the table. And your communications person, your public relations person, if they're doing their job well, they're navigating an organization and they're a trusted partner throughout that organization and have a seat at the table, because their job, and I always used to say this to my old boss, and he kept me around for about 18 years. So, but I used to say to him, you pay me to tell you what you don't want to hear. And that to this day, we have to identify risk, identify what we know, what we don't know, and we have to be ready to tell either our bosses, clients, etc., or even the media, and be confident and courageous that, we're going to tell you something you don't want to hear. And I think that candor and that courage, we talked about skills, I would add those to that list as well, is that candor, that confidence, the courage, the C3. So just something to think about.
Linda, I love how you draw the parallels. There's so much that public relations and journalism have in common when they're working together through integrity and facts and courage, because those are some of the traits that we've talked about in this class. Key components to good journalism. And I can see clearly why you are part of the Maine Press Association.
Well, thank you.
Steve, do you have any closing thoughts before Linda ends her session?
I think I have a big question that I need to save for another time because it's just big. So,
Question.
do you want one more question?
Now you've got me intrigued.
All right. So, and again, this may be another time.
Okay.
I've been an educator for many years, and one reason I'm an educator is I care very much about our young adults and the generations that are coming after me.
Mm-hmm.
And as a person who cares about the generations that are coming after me, I care very much about the state of the earth and the climate crisis. And many people I'm talking to saying the coronavirus is going to be minuscule in its impact compared to the climate crisis and its impact on us as humanity. I'm aware that the fossil fuel industry had a very strong public relations campaign and marketing campaign in the 1980s in which it had all the data that we have today about climate change, and it chose to tell the opposite story of the facts. It chose to have a whole PR campaign that everything's fine, we can stick with fossil fuels and we'll all be fine. And we see now that we've wasted 3 decades. We've had 30 years in which we could have been making major changes and we haven't. And so that's the bigness of my question. It's maybe about when PR serves individual interests, or when it only serves those who have the money to pay for it, then the only people who have their voices told or get the PRs, those who have the money to pay for it. And in a capitalist society, unfortunately, that's the most powerful. So what can we do in a capitalist context when money controls so much of the messaging that happens?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it is a one we could probably spend an hour talking about. What I would suggest is really understanding kind of the sister industry, which is what we call public affairs, which is influencing hearts and minds. And so when you think about and you take when you take climate change, one might argue you could overlay that with, you know, the arguments of the tobacco industry for so long. You know, so if you think about, you know, what was being said and who was being said, and you're now dealing, I mean, what was being said, who was saying it, and kind of how that shifted over time. I think to this day, and you can take the opioid crisis as an example, people are getting smarter. The cycle from opioids are good to opioids are now bad has been very short if you were to compare that to the conversation around tobacco and how many years, you know, tobacco was good and then it was bad. So I think the consumer, I think the media, I think there are a lot of elements that are going, that are different today than when they were, you know, back in the 70s, you know, back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And so to look at that, you really have to think about the cycle of communication. You have to think of the longevity of the campaigns, the stickiness of the messages, the simplicity of the messages, and think through, you know, why do these campaigns today still ring true with the general consumer or with different audiences? And you could take the climate change, tobacco, opioids, you could even look at, you know, sugar, you could look at, you know, all things, whether it, you know, the soft drink battles in New York. There are things that we know that are bad for us, but why do we embrace them as good? And why does it take so long to realize that they're not good for the greater humanity over time? Those are some big questions, Stephen. And I think they might deserve, you know, maybe I'd like to hear from all of your students on that if they were to really dig in and do some research into some of those campaigns. But that's an area that
Maybe
no, go ahead.
maybe we'll have to have another whole topic focused on from bad to good or from good to bad, and have students do some research on it, and then have you back in another semester to address it. What do you think?
Well, and that might be whether it be me or there are people who are a lot smarter than I am in the public affairs world. So that would be kind of interesting to have someone who specializes, say, in public policy or lobbying or different things along those lines, because that's what we're talking about here is large scale lobbying campaigns that are, multifaceted and, span years. Look at what's happening. And I'm not judging, I'm just saying you can kind of follow some of the tracks and the time from good messaging to bad messaging. If you look at opioids, you look at Juul, what's happening with the smokeless tobacco and I can't think of what the inhaler, what are they called?
Vaping,
thank you. So if you look at the cycles are shorter than they used to be in terms of, you've got the good messaging out there, and then all of a sudden the public, the realization, the connection to the bad. And I think the media has a role in that they're shining a light on, the health effects, and they're shining a light on the science, and they're shining a light on the reality of what's happening. And it does matter today. You can see young people are taking up causes, they're taking up causes in their school to, stop vaping. They're taking up causes, on climate change. And I think the hard part today is there are so many causes. How do you focus on any one? Really affect change in one direction versus another direction.
Thank you.
thank you, Linda. We really appreciate you being here today. And I know that this particular program is going to have a lot of legs and a lot of circulation to educate and inform so many viewers. So thank you again for being with us today.
Oh, you're very welcome. Certainly, would be open to any feedback or anything you would have liked to have heard, or any insights into today's conversation. That would be great.
Great. Thank you very much, Linda.
Thank
and
you.
We'll see you again soon.
All righty. Bye now.
Bye-bye,
Thank you.
Linda.
Bye.
Thank you.